So, the Odyssey. What you'll probably find difficult, what would probably the biggest obstacle for you when reading this is A, that it's in verse, and B, that it's kind of long. And there's not too much I can do about that. It's kind of long because there's like a lot of adventures, and I just gave you sort of a greatest hits assortment of them. It's in verse because this was originally done in the oral tradition. We've talked about that before with things like Gilgamesh and the Ramayana, that a lot of the ancient books and the ancient adventure stories really were done were sung by a bard at night, and that was how he sang for his supper, basically. And the Iliad and the Odyssey, two great works by Homer, are both part of that tradition. And the oral tradition is almost always in verse because prose is too hard to memorize. And if you're remembering something and it's basically happening among people who can't read or write, the poet usually can't read or write, the audience can't read or write, it's all memorized. It's way easier to memorize verse than prose, as if you think about how much easier it is to learn a song than it is to memorize, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. So those things are kind of built in. One quick thing about Homer, he, like Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, we don't know anything about Homer. We don't know if he was a real person even, or maybe that he was just a name slapped onto these ancient poems that people loved. For all we know, the name Homer might just have been another word for bard, could have been just a description of his occupation. Nobody knows. The only thing we've got, there's a legend that he was blind. And where that seems to come from is that in the end of the Odyssey, not in the part I'm having you read, there's a blind bard. And so people think, oh, well, that's kind of cool. It kind of caught people's imaginations. And so there's a tradition that Homer was blind, but we have no idea whether he really was. So Homer is really, all we know about him is that it was the name assigned to the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we don't even really know that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by the same person. The books feel different. So it wouldn't be amazing if they had different authors. And the other thing is that with the oral tradition, it's hard even to talk about an author because that's like asking who's the author of a nursery rhyme or a fairy tale. These things get passed down and repeated from person to person, and they change along the way. We don't know who eventually wrote it down. Maybe that was somebody named Homer. But the poems were composed in this kind of, really by the culture, probably more than by any particular individual. And maybe somebody came along who was really better at this than anyone else, and so his version was the one that stuck. But, that's what we know. We don't know much. However, the Greeks loved these poems. We do know that. They recited them. These poems mattered to the ancient Greeks the way, say, Shakespeare matters to us. They just were seen as the greatest works, at least from the ancestry of this culture. And by the way, we've talked before about how Gilgamesh or the Ramayana presents heroes, and one of the things you learn about a culture is by seeing how it depicts its heroes. That tells you about who people thought was the best kind of person to be and who they aspired to be. Well, the Homer filled that role for the Greeks. Not only the Odyssey, but the Iliad had all these great warriors, and it was all about what the great warriors were like. And the Iliad's an interesting book too. I recommend it to you if you ever get the chance to read it. But I gave you the Odyssey because Odysseus is in some sense the most, for me, I would say, and I think for a lot of people, is the most interesting of the Greek heroes. Probably because he's the smartest. In the Iliad, you get all these mighty men, these mighty warriors who beat their chests and kick butt. And that's okay as far as it goes. But Odysseus is the clever one. He's talked about all the way through. He's the smart one. He also is tough and he can kick butt, but that he's the shrewd one. And that lends an extra dimension. So, keep that in the back of your mind. The selection I'm giving you, where it's set in the larger story, is that Odysseus has washed up on shore, shipwrecked and broken. Everybody else, he's the only survivor of his voyage. He's been trying to get home from the Trojan War. The Trojan War lasted for 10 years, and Odysseus takes 10 years to get home. So he's away from home for 20 years. And the arc of this poem is a man who was away, first at war and then in various other kinds of danger for 20 years. And he's trying to get back to his wife and his child and his home. The son, a son that he knows exists, but that he hasn't seen since he was an infant. Telemachus, his son, is now a young man, but Odysseus doesn't even know him. And Telemachus doesn't know his father. Part of the Odyssey is told from Telemachus' point of view. He goes looking for his father. Telemachus and his mother, Penelope, are having trouble at home because the vultures are circling. Since Odysseus has been away so long and everybody assumes he's dead, other people want to be king of that island, the island of Ithaca, which is what Odysseus was the king of. So other people want his kingship. They want to marry his widow because that'll solidify their claim to the kingship. They're hanging out at Odysseus's palace and eating up all his property, and just wining and dining and feasting, and they've basically taken the place over. Penelope is the archetype of the loyal wife. She doesn't want to remarry any of these jerks, but they're kind of in a position to force her to. Telemachus wants to defend his mother and defend also his own inheritance because that's what they're consuming. He hates these guys, the suitors, they're known as the suitors of Penelope, but he can't get rid of them. There's a bunch of them and one of him, and he's just a kid, though he's coming into his maturity. So that's the situation back home, and Telemachus longs to have his father return somehow and rescue them. And that will eventually, well, I'll spoil it for you, but it's about that homecoming and about home having to be re-won because you've been away for so long and things have fallen apart. And Odysseus has to basically save his place in the world and has to save his family. Okay, that's the outline of the whole book. This selection, where it fits in the book, Odysseus washes up on shore, shipwrecked, the only survivor, and he runs into some friendly people, especially a friendly young woman, a princess named Nausicaa. And she's struck by him. The goddess Athena makes him look godlike and beautiful, and she's kind of gets a crush on him, basically. And she takes him home, and her parents and the royalty of this place where they wash up, they think this guy must really be something just from the looks of him, but they don't know who he is exactly. And they give him they're very gracious and friendly. They give him a banquet, and then at a certain point in the banquet, someone is telling the tale, the bard is telling a tale of the Trojan War, and they notice that Odysseus has tears in his eyes. And they ask him, what's going on? Why have we upset you? And do you maybe want to tell us who you are? And the selection I gave you is kind of his answer to that question. All right. So I'm giving you a bunch of the adventures he had. Not quite everything, I'm jumping around. I'm excerpting it. But you get to hear, as they get to hear, as his dinner companions get to hear, the story of what Odysseus has been through as he tries to get home from the war.